Welcome back to Establish the Edge for episode 5 of the off-season's projection special with myself, Mike Leone, and Ben Gretch. You can find Gretch's stuff at bengretch.substack.com and his podcast with Sean Siegel, Stealing Bananas. Today, we're going to do the AFC North for episode 5. And we'll start with Baltimore, who we both have at a 58% called pass rate. So we're right in line there. Gretch has a little bit more play volume at 64. We're at 63, very close. Ultimately does squeeze out about an attempt more per game spread between rushing and passing for Gretch. Baltimore's, anything from you on the play calling front, Ben?
Just that there were some pretty big changes under Todd Monken last year. The pass rate was more neutral. The play volume was solid. I'm bumping it a little from even last year, I guess, because I'm expecting them to be even better in year 2. I didn't really make any notes on that. It's interesting to see that you guys are a little lower on play volume, and I think that is if I'm less than a play above average, you're like very slightly below average, I think. So we're both right around average. But if anything, I would probably move back toward average because they are going to run and the clock's going to move and that kind of stuff. But good teams run a lot of plays, so I think I'm just expecting this to be a good offense and run a lot of plays.
Yeah, I'm also, we have the same pass rate, so we're building in a bump too. Part of that for us is, the defense was just insanely good last year, and just, a little bit of assumption in that regressing, not that they won't be really good, but they might not be outlier good like they were last year, and that just could affect game script type stuff. As far as that spits out for Lamar, we're both around 26 passing touchdowns. You have them a little bit more efficient, just over 4,000 yards. We're at 3,800 yards. Rushing line, we're pretty similar, around 850 yards, 5-ish touchdowns. You've got him at 385 fantasy points. I've got him at 355. The rushing touchdown, we're off by like 1.2. Somewhat curious your thoughts there. I know last year was somewhat frustrating if you were a Lamar owner with it's just the straight handoffs to Gus. They didn't really do some of the stuff by the goal line with Lamar that you see with some of the bigger mobile quarterbacks.
Yeah, his design run rate last year was a career low by a lot. Or I guess 2021 was another year where it was somewhat low, but every other year was like, I have it as like a 22% of, I have that as a percentage of dropbacks, which design runs aren't even dropbacks. So it's not a great stat. It's like a ratio, but because I don't have like snaps, you would do it as snaps. But anyway, it was previously over 22% in this ratio. And then last year it was 15. The 2021 year was 17.7. So anyway, it was definitely low. His scramble rate was up a few points to offset that at a career high 11.4% of dropbacks that he took off and ran, which was, I think, nice to see. The overall rushing yardage I played with a lot. I do think Lamar's when we talk about the different mobile quarterbacks and how good their rushing can be, I think Lamar is sort of on a different scale than the other quarterbacks. I mean, he runs more and he runs more efficiently. He's just an incredible runner. He's very, agile and fast and just there's athletic quarterbacks. And then there's Lamar Jackson, who's like a ball carrier. Like he's very, very good. The point about TDs is really interesting. He's never had more than Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts both had 15 TDs last year. Lamar's never had double-digit TDs. I don't think he's ever had more than 7 in a season. I have him at 5.9. You guys have him, like you said, even a TD and a half below that, which I guess makes sense. If you're really into they're going to use Derrick Henry in close. Yeah, 7 is his career high. I had 5 last year. I had him. He's had 7 twice. I have him at 5.9. You guys have him about 4.8. It's probably in that range somewhere, right? It's hard to tell, I guess.
And we've got him as QB3 with all that said and done. The rushing touchdown thing is really, the major point there to me is just that Hurts and Allen are a tier above to me, but all these players actually go pretty closely because people are kind of waiting on those top quarterbacks. I think there might be some value in the elite quarterbacks this year with the prices falling down a little bit. It can be tough construction wise, but I do find myself grabbing Allen and Hurts quite a bit, and then Lamar to an extent. So have him ahead of Mahomes. We hit on a previous episode that the ETR stuff could be a little bit light on some of the Mahomes passing metrics. So speaking of Henry possibly taking all these touchdowns that Gus had, we've got him at just under 250 rush attempts. You've got him at 267. We're pretty similar as far as receiving involvement, pretty similar in terms of rushing touchdowns, right around 11. Just some discrepancy in yardage from that volume puts you at 226 half PPR points, us at 205. And again, our stuff generally runs slightly more conservative. So that's pretty close projection after you account for that.
Yeah,
Henry,
it doesn't make. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say it doesn't alarm me that I'm about 20 attempts higher than you. I usually am with the workhorse backs because you guys are factoring in the type of risk that I'm blowing by in my projections, and it makes sense. The thing that stands out to me here is the gap in rushing yards. I think is enough that I think I'm meaningfully higher in yards per carry, probably. And part of that was that Henry's missed tackles for us, yards after contact stuff didn't really fall off last year in Tennessee, and his yards per carry has been a lot weaker the last couple of years. But that's mostly been the Tennessee offensive line rather than his advanced metrics. And the way that Lamar can actually positively influence efficiency, I went back to a 4.6 yards per carry, which for Henry, it's been down towards the 4.0 range, 4.1 or something like that the last couple of years. One of the things I noted is with his missed tackles, forced yards after contact stuff, and I do it like per touch and per attempt and all that, it looks like peak Gus Edwards, who typically was close to or above 5 yards per carry at his peak. Last year, Edwards' stuff fell off. And so he was down at like 4.1 in this offense, but he wasn't creating, missed tackles forced or getting a lot of yards after contact last year. And like I said, Henry's didn't fall off over in his sample. And so I actually think Henry's yards per carry efficiency could rebound. It's a tough thing to get right for a 30-year-old running back, right? But like we don't usually see efficiency rebound, but you're going from behind a really weak offensive line to a situation where Lamar Jackson's rushing threat positively influences rushing efficiency for every back that plays with him. And so I do think you can meaningfully bump Henry's rushing efficiency, the yardage side of it, because of that.
Yeah, we're only at 4.3, but I'm probably going to bump his ceiling efficiency stuff a little bit. That's one of the levers we can pull. End of the day, I think he's pretty overdrafted. It's an underdog where it's half PPR. He has the best price, and that's the best scoring system for him. So were times when he would fall to 3-4 turn. I would get my Henry exposure. He goes to the middle of the third. We have him as overvalued there, but like I get it. But when you get him on FFPC and DraftKings and full PPR sites, it's a tougher bet to make with us not projecting very much catch volume. He's never had a lot of catch volume. Baltimore doesn't really throw to the backs, and he goes like round 2 there, so it's like an even steeper cost. So our ranks have like this, one of the biggest ADP gaps to our rank, negatively on Henry on these full PPR sites where he's thrusted up more. Have you been drafting much Henry?
No, and that's a great point. Even though I was saying I got kind of optimistic in his line and how I projected it, volume-wise, efficiency-wise, as I went through the Baltimore projection, I have him leading the league in rushing touchdowns, even though I do have Lamar at a little more rushing TDs than you guys, because I just have it very concentrated on those two, I guess, their overall rushing TDs. Even despite all that, he comes in lower in my overall running back projections than where he should go. And I even in half PPR, and I was like, man, I mean, like I have, like you mentioned on underdog, he goes a little later, but I have like ETN ahead of him still. And ETN's in half PPR, and ETN's, stat line is more dependent on, some receiving volume. Certainly in full PPR, that gap is larger. I mean, just the total lack of receiving that you would expect from a Lamar Jackson back, which is, pretty typical because he's going to take off and run rather than check down. And Henry's profile is not that anyway. He's not going to probably play on passing downs. He's 30 years old. Like, I think they're going to ride him plenty on first and second down. But I mean, I think really if you want Henry to pay off, you're expecting 18 to 20 rushing TDs, which I think some people are. Like Gus Edwards had 13 last year. I think people are just going, Derrick Henry's going to run for high teens, 18, rushing TDs.
Yeah, you're expecting him also, I think, in addition to running super pure on the rushing touchdowns, which could happen in this offense in the way they played, but them to go to more of a workhorse back that they haven't really had in the past. And I know talking with Levitan, we were initially even lower on Henry, had him like 220 carries or something Levitan thinks they're going to use him more like full workhorse, and he could get to like 290 carries. If he gets there, that's where he can pay off. But you kind of need both things to happen. Like you need him to get the volume and run pretty good on rush TD, and you need him to sustain that efficiency at an elevated age for running back. So just
he has suggested that number could be large, that like his running back rush attempt share could be large. He's talked about that a little bit. So, I mean, I can see some optimism there, but I still think he's a tough profile to play at his cost for the reasons.
Agreed. Are you taking any, with that in mind, some flags in the profile, mostly the age and the tread on the tires, any dart throws, end of drafts between, Keaton Mitchell showed explosiveness last year, but torn ACL week 15. When does he come back? Is he effective when he comes back? Rasheen Ali is a rookie they brought in. Just really, complete guess there as far as if he's going to, be able to crack meaningful touches or not.
Yeah, he doesn't have a profile that is super enticing. And Mitchell's a guy they really liked last year, talked up. And then when he got healthy, because he was hurt like in the first part of the season, when he got healthy, they used him. And then right when he started to go off, he tore his ACL, unfortunately. Very small sample. But I went back actually and looked, and there's some quotes from that time where Harbaugh's saying that it was a clean tear. It's a single ligament. It's like they were very optimistic about it. I don't think he's going to be ready for week 1 or anything. I do think he's going to play in the second half of the year, and I think a lot of people are expecting that he won't. And when you're playing him, he feels like more of a true handcuff. You're saying, okay, Derrick Henry doesn't make it the full season, and then Mitchell's the guy that rises out of this group as their most dynamic runner in the second half. So I think like, especially in like best ball, if I have like a Houston stack as a bring back, I think he makes sense because I would then be playing it for the late season element of it. And managed in redraft, I kind of feel like you can just keep an eye on him on the waiver wire, but maybe if you play in a deep league, you can stash him. But he's the one that, his efficiency was really, really strong last year. I think Justice Hill's going to be the clear number 2 early in the year, and then Mitchell's going to be the guy that has the upside if Henry misses time. That's the way I would look at it.
Yep. And I've taken him in some of the 20 round drafts, less so on underdog, but you get sometimes an extra spot where you can make that late season dart throw bet and feel a little bit better about possibly taking a 0. Let's go to receiver. Definitely want to talk Zay Flowers. We have discrepancy here. I know we've been lower than the market on Zay Flowers. We're only at 107 targets. You're at 125. As far as Bateman, we're at 65. You're at 77. And I think a lot of this stems to like we've got more 2 tight end sets Baltimore playing this year. And I don't feel very confidently about that. But I know Levitan and Herzig are pretty into Isaiah Likely, so it kind of flows together as to why we're a little bit shorter the wide receiver group here. So your thoughts on Flowers and Bateman?
Well, the 2 tight end thing is really intriguing, and I would be really interested in that bull case because what I saw last year was a very different offense in the Greg Roman offense, and it starts with the Mark Andrews discussion, if you don't mind me jumping there. But his first 5 years of his career, his ADOT was over 10, which is very high for a tight end. And his slot rate was in the 55% to 66% range, very consistent. Last year's slot rate was over 80%, which is very high, right? Like basically half of his non-slot snaps. I mean, you could say it the other way. His wide percentage was a career low and his inline percentage was a career low. Like his other alignments basically dissipated. And a lot of that was stuff that in the old Roman offense, he would come out of like an inline formation, but run up at the seam and split the tight ends and the safeties in cover 2. And that's where the high ADOT stuff would come from. But he was a really traditional slot, much lower ADOT last year. His ADOT, I said, had been over 10, was 8.2, was like 2 yards lower than his previous career low. And his targets per out run fell off quite a bit. And so his efficiency was still there. His yards per target was still there. But I talk about the depth adjusted efficiency. And one of the things I've looked at with him, it's like, again, a little bit nuanced, but he's always been very efficient in part because of the high ADOT. Last year, he added a lot more like yards after the catch and the efficiency was different. He looks way more efficient relative to his ADOT than he had typically been, which gives me a little bit of pause, but I'm still projecting to be a very efficient player because he is just typically very efficient. But I take that as like, they talked about this offense being more like the Louisville offense, spread offense. They drafted Flowers. They brought in OBJ. They were going to put more investment on receivers. and that it's not as much of a tight end focused offense as Greg Roman's offense clearly was. And as part of that, Andrews, still a hugely important player to this team and to this offense, still has a strong targets per out run. Still, they're doing more dropbacks, so he's running more routes. I still think he's a really good tight end. I just don't think he's necessarily situated to have the best seasons of his career in this particular offense. We're talking about like a little bit more of a specific role. And then as that translates over to Likely, who you mentioned, he played a decent amount after Andrews got hurt. Only 13% targets per out run for him. He had 20.9% on similar route volume as a rookie in 2022. That's a massive difference. And he was a little bit of a higher ADOT in 2022 as well. So he got into this lower ADOT role and wasn't really earning a whole lot of volume on it. I just feel like I'm a little bit more concerned about particularly Likely as a play other than like a handcuff, but also like a little concerned about Andrew's ceiling in the way that this offense looks and how he seemed to be a little bit pigeonholed into the slot. That's maybe too specific, but I think if somebody really blows up, it feels like it's probably one of the receivers, probably Zay Flowers is kind of the way that I'm viewing it.
Yeah. So just covering the tight ends first, since we talked about him a decent bit. We did ding Likely in our rankings recently. We were pretty high on him for a while. This is one of the guys we were more split on in our ETR Slack. I've been kind of the Likely bear. I just not bull, where you mentioned some of this stuff about his usage last year. I don't think people realize how pure he ran in terms of fantasy point scoring in some of those games with Andrews out. So I think there's a tendency to think like, oh, if Andrews gets out, you're getting a top 5 tight end. So, none of these guys have upside. You might as well take them. And I'm like, I'd maybe have him ranked like with Dallas Goedert. If we knew Andrews was out today,
right,
like that's tight end 11. That's my thought is like, you're not, this isn't like,
I completely agree. He ran really hot on TDs. He had 5 TDs in the final 5 games of the regular season. But like you go look at his catch and yardage numbers, and it was actually the yardage numbers were solid too because he ran really hot on like yards per target. He was, the yardage and the TD efficiency was really, really strong. Like you go look at the playoffs, he had 2 catches in both playoff games. Where I know Andrews played a little in those games, but wasn't fully healthy. And then he also had 2 catches in week 17 and week 18. I guess he didn't play a ton in week 18, but week 17, like 2 catches, 2 TDs is a great example. Like there's a lot of his late game log is never caught more than 5 balls in a game, never had 100 yards, just ran really hot on TDs. I don't know. I feel the same way.
Yeah. So, I don't mind him late on underdog still. I'm not like totally out on Likely, just didn't like him as much as our rank was. I think where we have him now is a little bit more fitting in the TE 20s. And then Andrews, I'm just like, I feel indifferent on Andrews. Like I'm like structurally trying to get the top 7 tight ends. So when Andrews is the guy that kind of falls to me where I'm in my draft, I take him, but I'm not like forcing him. And I'm following ADP on those tight ends like somewhat closely.
Yeah. I've gotten back around to him some because people have made good cases. Like my buddies over at Ship Chasing, Pat Crane and Pete Overzet, are both taking a lot of him, and they've made good cases that he's just like a really good football player. You don't want to be out on him. I guess I'm just worried that he has like kind of a floor season for him where it's like a lot of volume, but because he's stuck in this slot low ADOT role and the efficiency comes down a little bit, like the yards per target comes down with the lower ADOT. It's like a good but not great season, but that's still fine at his cost. Like, that's one of the things about being a tight end, right? Like that's still very playable.
Yeah. And our projection on Andrews is very similar, roughly like 75 for 900 yards and 7 receiving touchdowns. Coming back to Flowers, I'm looking at our projection though, and I do think we're sort of like double counting conservatively against Flowers, where we've brought back his target share a little bit, just expecting more Andrews than we had last year with the injury, but then probably didn't build in enough. Like this guy had a really good rookie season, year 2 breakout type upside. So I don't know if we'll come up on him on base, but either through the base projection or the ceiling projection, going to come up on Zay Flowers some to just avoid that double counting that I think somewhat harsh on him in our ranks currently.
And another pro on him is the Odell Beckham departure isn't like not meaningful because I mean he ended up in a pretty part-time role, but his targets per out run were actually really solid. Like when they put him in, they seemed to use him a lot. He had a 14.98 op, but still had a 21% targets per out run, which is a high number for a deep threat. Gives you a lot of like the weighted targets per out run stat I reference sometimes. It makes him look very solid at volume earning. Probably had a ton of air yards per route, for example. Don't have that number right in front of me, but I'm sure he was one of the highest in the league in air yards per route. Those routes are gone. I don't know who might replace that. It could be Devontae Walker. It could be like Tylan Wallace or somebody, finally takes a step forward, but probably not as concentrated as Odell Beckham, who you're kind of proactively trying to get the ball because of like who he is and how much money you paid him and all of those things. I think some of that shifts back to Zay Flowers, right? There's now routes that Zay Flowers is out in that he has a better shot to earn a target on. That helps, I think, his target projection too.
Rashad Bateman is someone I've been martingaling and back in on Rashad Bateman just at his cost. They've said a lot of really good things about him. I know he's a prospect we all really liked. I remember draft night, Crane was so high on Rashad Bateman. And we had some arguments about that. But, you don't want to keep giving guys shots over and over and over again. But, like, he's the clear wide receiver, too, it looks like, on a pretty good offense. He's still young. I'm sort of taking my shots here with Rashad Bateman. He's going on underdog, wide receiver 75. I think he's a solid bet still.
I mean, I'm not taking as much of him as I want to, but I feel the same way. My sentiment's the same. Like, he's been banged up. We know he was hurt last year. All the talks about his foot and all that stuff. There's some film related stuff where like maybe he just wasn't getting the ball in this offense enough because he was like, there's a Twitter clip that made the rounds a couple months ago. I can't remember who to give credit to on that, but it's like, look at all these routes Rashad Bateman went on, but they weren't even really looking his way. And he actually like looks good, like off the line and getting separation in this clip. And I don't know, it's very like, it's not in the data. It's just vibes, but I mean, I'm kind of in on Rashad Bateman too. I guess you could say the team's moves, letting Odell Beckham go and not really adding additional wide receivers and what they're saying about him, they think he's going to fill that hole. So that's positive.
So we'll see. And again, like we're talking wide receiver 75, so this isn't like a guy you're breaking the bank. When I say I really like him, it's like I want more than the field. It's not like a guy who's critical to my draft, just to be clear there. The other guy that you would be drafting like Devontae Walker, rookie out of North Carolina. I know RotoViz was like really higher than market on him for dynasty stuff, really athletic player, had some issues with his eligibility his last season with North Carolina. I think he missed some time and then was able to get that worked out, but his draft capital was a little bit disappointing. I get the sense that you and Sean are still pretty high on him, and we actually have him, for 40 targets, which is, pretty solid for the type of draft capital he got. So yeah, definitely wanted to hear what you thought about Tez.
Well, he's not one that I can even speak to being particularly high on. I know Sean is. He's written him up over at RotoViz, as you mentioned, and he was really good. I know early on, I think his second year, and then he transferred a little bit weaker in the stats last year, but some mitigating factors for that. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of following Sean on this one. Like, Sean's made some positive arguments about him that, some of the stats maybe don't speak to the overall profile, that there's some other upside here. I know he's comparing him to Terry McLaurin, who's a guy who, did a lot better in the NFL than the college production may have suggested. And so that's the, you hear that, I'm like, all right, well, I'm in. I'm taking.
Yeah, he's also in redraft leagues. The fact that you can just drop these players, like you probably want to take a guy like him late and follow, if he's the wide receiver 3 out of the gate, like that's a big win already. You're holding him on the roster and seeing what happens. You'd probably need to be in a pretty deep redraft league to take Tez, I guess, thinking through that. But, I guess applying it to best ball, like similar to Keaton Mitchell, like I feel better about it in the 20-round drafts where there's just more roster spots to take kind of these upside dart throws that are a little shakier floor wise.
I do think Nelson Aguilar is going to play some. And so my worry is like, and my projection reflects it, that it'll be a little more rotational down the depth chart than some teams. As you mentioned, with like your guys' projections are factoring that in as well. Mine are even more concentrated than yours, but they're more unconcentrated than some of my other teams, because I do think that down the depth chart stuff is relevant for this roster for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's go to Pittsburgh. We'll see if Ben makes it through this segment of the show talking about Arthur Smith, but they bring him over as OC. We both have the exact same called pass rate, 55.5%. It's where we settled on, which I think might be our lowest, my lowest projection, at least on the ETR side on pass rate. I got to check here. Yeah, that's our lowest. So shout out Arthur Smith, lowest called pass rate, and it doesn't come from a team because we expect them to be really good, which it usually does when we get an extremely low called pass rate. And in terms of play volume, we've got them at 62 plays. Gretch is a little bit more bearish at 61.2 plays. Just tough to get a ton of play volume when you're running that much and you aren't that good.
Yeah, I mean, both Arthur Smith and Russell Wilson have operated slow run-based offenses in their last stops. Atlanta was last and second from last in pass rate over expected the last 2 years. They have two good running backs. They traded their target earning wide receiver, and more or less, they replaced him by drafting Roman Wilson, but they're talking like Van Jefferson's actually their wide receiver too. I don't think they really replaced Deontay Johnson. Yeah, I mean, they're telling you what they're going to be. Arthur Smith likes to tell you in all of his press conferences that he hates fantasy football and hates you for liking fantasy football. So I would listen to the guy personally.
So as this flows, then we get to the quarterback situation, and you've got Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. Russell Wilson's a decent sized favorite to be the starter out of the gate. How long that lasts, we'll see. I know I have a bet with Pat Kerrane that Russ is the starting quarterback week 14, I believe it is. And it's just a straight up 50-50 bet. So there's no odds being given on that. I feel pretty good about that one, but we'll see. The way I've been drafting these players is, well, one, I'm underweight both of them. I don't want a ton of the Pittsburgh quarterback situation. I will take Russ if I have a team that does involve maybe some stacking with Pittsburgh, and I maybe need a little bit more floor at quarterback as a third guy, and I think the correlation maybe plays out a little bit better. If I'm desperation QB3, my room's devoid of upside, I don't have any Pittsburgh players, that's where I'm well, I'll just grab Fields in the case that he starts and just can have a crazy running season, and he obviously has a bit more of a ceiling for that reason than Russ if he were to take the job, whether it's due to skill or injury.
Yeah, I guess I've taken some Fields, but I don't necessarily love it. It's, you're trying to read the tea leaves a little bit here. Both Mike Tomlin and Arthur Smith, I think, are maybe a little bit more stubborn than your average coach, might be one way to put it. A little bit more of your old school mentality. And I think because of that, they're more likely to lean on the veteran who has had the long career and has won a Super Bowl, even though he does some of the stuff that Fields does wrong, I think would annoy these coaches, which is that he takes a lot of sacks and stuff, but Russell Wilson takes a lot of sacks too. It's they're both going to be quarterbacks that take a lot of sacks, don't necessarily get the ball out at a high rate. That's one of the key things for, pass rate is it doesn't really matter. I mean, pass attempts is it doesn't really matter which quarterback's in there. If the pass rate is already low, we could be wrong on that, but we're both projecting it the same, which I think is fascinating. And it's my lowest pass rate as well. And then for the stat with Fields has always been that the called dropbacks turn into pass attempts at a league low rate, because his rates of sacks and scrambles where the ball doesn't get out of his hand are both really high. They're near the league high. And when you add both those numbers together, it is the league high by a lot. 28% of his dropbacks don't turn into pass attempts, which is a big, big number. And the other little thing about that, we've talked about that stat before, but it means less incompletions and more clock running. When you take the sack, when you scramble, clock runs, slows the offense down. It's effectively a rushing play in some of these situations as opposed to a throwaway that stops the clock. That's why you get the Joe Flacco Browns offense last year had a ton of plays, because you're getting incompletions on those, it stops the clock. So this offense, Fields is really bad for that. Russ is also pretty bad for that. He's not scrambling as much, but he's going to take sacks at a high rate. Both of these quarterbacks are not going to turn a lot of called passes into pass attempts, relative speaking. They're still going to turn 80% plus of them into, or maybe not Fields, but probably 80% of the called passes will be pass attempts in this offense this year, but that's low for the league level. And then you're saying the called pass rate's already low. So the overall pass volume, multiple ways, is getting dinged here. Not great, Bob.
No, not great. I did think earlier in the offseason there was some opportunity with the running backs where people were like, oh, we're just staying away from Pittsburgh. And then like really it's like, well, if they're so run heavy, there might be some opportunity here. Looking at our stuff, we have this more concentrated in the RB1 spot, 240 carries for Najee Harris, 146 for Jaylen Warren. You're a bit more split with 191 for Najee, 171 for Warren. Cordarrelle Patterson, we both have for carries in like the 30s ish. So Arthur Smith did use his backs annoyingly. I'm looking at this and thinking we're probably going to tighten it up. Like as I was prepping for this, I was looking at the carry share last year, and it's still in Atlanta, and it's still hard to believe that the final carry share I have is Bijan 41%, Algier 35.5%, and I don't think there was one Bijan game where he like didn't play due to migraine.
Right.
He like got
The
one
migraine.
carry. So it's like slightly skewed because of that game, but not. It's still tighter than probably we have the Najee Warren. And the Najee Warren in theory should be tighter than Bijan Algier was.
Mike, it's not fantasy football. I don't know why you expect him to give the ball to Bijan Robinson more than that. It's not fantasy football. Yeah, I have pretty significant concern with Najee, not Najee's talent, because I think like he's actually good at like making guys miss some of the missed tackles for stuff and that kind of stuff. He's just not explosive enough. He makes guys miss and he doesn't pick up a lot of yards. I think you go look at his yards per reception every year. He's had a decent little receiving role, and they've been putrid. They've been really poor. It just confirms the low yards per carry in some ways. Like he's just not an explosive player. I don't think that means that he's bad necessarily. There's a role probably, but when you look at Jaylen Warren by comparison, he's elite at like all of it. He's elite at the missed tackles for stuff. He's explosive on top of it. The yards per carry is very good. It's just a very different type of back in terms of what kind of yardage you would expect, what kind of yardage you would project. Like I have their rushing attempts closer, but I do have Najee with 20 more rush attempts, but I wind up projecting Warren for more rushing yards because it's a lot easier to give him a meaningful bump in yards per carry. And that bump would carry over to his receiving efficiency. These are, I mean, yes, the running backs are both going to be used. They're both priced in a certain way. Najee was a little bit better last year in some ways than he had been prior. And I can see drafting him, and I have drafted him. But it's just tricky because I just think there's a lot more like efficiency upside. If it's going to be split, I want the efficiency upside. There's a lot more efficiency upside on Warren, and he goes after Najee. So you're really still just banking on workload with Najee, which has been the deal all along, and it's never really paid off.
Yeah. We've also got Najee at 4.2 yards per carry compared to 4.7 for Jaylen Warren. Only slight pushbacks. I think I guess I don't know if you want to call this efficiency or what, but I do think the touchdown upside for Najee in the way that he'd be deployed is some way he claws back a little bit of upside from Warren. But
I do have him at a higher touchdown rate per touch than Warren, and then I'm giving him a few more touches as well. So yeah, I have Najee with a bump in TDs as well.
And we're very similar on reception stuff. Have about 25 for Najee, about 50 for Warren. I'm at the point with those guys where I'm kind of fine with either of them at cost. We'll probably, like I said, come down a little bit on Najee, who we were ahead of ADP on, and get a little bit closer. I think they're both fine. I don't have a hot take there. I'm not super worried about Cordarrelle Patterson mixing in. I know they've talked about it, but just in some of his usage with Atlanta and stuff last year, I don't think he's going to be a huge threat to like have a ton of carries. Like he might have an annoying couple, and that's basically what we're projecting. Like,
but there's going to be
a game.
There's going to be so many that he can take a little bit, and there's still a lot, I think, as well. Is another way to think about it.
Yeah. Going to the pass catchers, it definitely gets tough here based on all the stuff we said with the play calling combined with the quarterback play, which was like very similar to what we had in Atlanta. You had quarterbacks that were taking sacks and scrambling some, and along with the heavy play calling. And, it was tough for some really talented pass catchers to hit a consistent ceiling. Drake London, Pitts had their moments, but they also had plenty of weeks where they were nothing. So we go to George Pickens. I'm on a pretty big George Pickens fade right now. I do understand some of the bull case, which like the yards per out run were really good last year. And if you break up the split between with Deontay, without Deontay, you do get a pretty good target share for George Pickens. I'm a little skeptical that target share without Deontay Johnson's going to like persist over a full season, which is where I think most of our bear case, on Pickens comes in, combined with all the systemic play calling stuff.
That's exactly the way that I would put it. I mean, just completely agree with you. The way that I would put that split sample data that seems to be a big thing holding up Pickens ADP. Deontay Johnson only missed, what was it, like 4 games? So in a 4-game sample, you have a couple good target games, your target share is going to look great. It's a 4-game sample of a rate stat. Like, let's be real. The fact is, for the full season, in an offense that Pat Freiermuth wasn't healthy or very good last year, and there wasn't really a third weapon, he still had a sub 20% targets per out run with that as part of the sample. He's a high ADOT guy, so that's fine. It's a weighted targets per out run note for a deep threat. But that's, again, as a per route stat. Drake London has had really good per route stats the last few years. So has Kyle Pitts. You have to then factor in how many routes are they actually going to run, how that's influenced by the offense. And Pickens, for the record, was below 15% targets per out run as a rookie. He did take a step forward, but is he this guy that's going to be able to earn volume at every single depth and be a legit alpha number one for a full season? I don't know that that's his profile. I do think he's a really good football player, but I don't know that that's his profile. My projection on him does have him coming meaningfully up in target share and really being a dominant number one. And he looks like you could justify taking him in his ADP range, which on Underdog is like in the 4th round. He's in that range of receivers. The other side of his discussion in fantasy is upside. We just talked about this offense being a low pass volume offense, that a lot of the dropbacks are not going to turn to pass attempts. This feels to me like one of those small hit, big miss plays, or maybe it's a small misplay too. Maybe he's going to be a small win, but I'm looking for, in the 4th round, a player that can be a 1st round pick next year because he was a difference maker and was a league winner. For me, Pickens, it's really, really hard to see how he does that. The highest raw targets for any Atlanta player over the past 3 years in Arthur Smith's offense, 117. That was one of the Drake London seasons. Highest raw targets in a Russ Denver offense the past 2 years, 109. Nobody in any of those offenses has hit 120. You do have, in a Justin Fields offense last year, DJ Moore going over 130 targets. And it's that kind of profile that could exist if you're getting first read targets in the shallow area and you're getting vertical targets and all that stuff. I do think, there's not a lot. That's what like Drake London could have been in the Arthur Smith offense. There's not a lot of reason to believe that Pickens is going to get used that dominantly or that he even necessarily has the skill set. He's a deeper threat kind of play to come do the line of scrimmage stuff that DJ Moore does.
Like, I'm trying to think, where were we taking London last year in drafts? Like, wasn't it still more like 5th, 6th round, or am I off on that?
I think it was like the 5th, yeah. And I didn't love him at that price.
Like, I think that was probably a better player. Dome, home stadium, like there's some better things leaning towards him than there are for Pickens. You brought up the Russ Denver wide receiver stuff. I look at Sutton last year and I think that's what you're hoping for, is like you just really running hot on the touchdowns. Like you're good enough on volume and efficiency's solid and you just run pure on touchdowns. But even that, to your point, is like not necessarily like a big hit at ADP.
There's a weird element to Arthur Smith's offenses too that is just, I didn't really know how to frame, sort of anecdotal, but when I look at the full season box scores, or not box scores, but team stats on Pro Football Reference, it's just noticeable when you look at the Arthur Smith offenses that there's like more targets for like the 10th and the 11th guy in the offense, which is sort of like the meme on Arthur Smith. He's going to drop plays for his 3rd tight end. But all 3 years in Atlanta, he had 10 plus guys with 10 plus targets. So that's just, 100 targets right there. And these are in offenses that were not even throwing 500 times in some cases. So that's 20% of the volume on the first 10 targets for the 10 players, right? Most teams are throwing a decent amount to at least like their 8th player. But it's like the 10th, the 11th guy in Arthur Smith's offense is still going to get a little chunk of that target share. He's going to get some plays drawn up for him. the stuff that was so maddening with like Jonnu last year for people who had Kyle Pitts like myself. I mean, as far as like this projection podcast series and the types of trends that we're looking at, Leone, and the things that we can help people with, this to me is one of the clearest ones where it's like you're playing fantasy for a range of floor to ceiling and that kind of stuff. All of the trends here are meaningful. There's a good sample on it. They're established. Even though I believe George Pickens is very good, I cannot in any way justify his price. And like this is a passing game that I want to avoid. I'm also out on Freiermuth. People are like, yeah, Arthur Smith loves his tight ends.
Yeah.
I pushed his target share too, and it just doesn't come. What's the ceiling case for him? How does he go compete with these elite tight ends this year in targets? The offense just doesn't allow for it. It's really tricky. It's touchdowns, like you said, with Pickens.
And we're right in line on Freiermuth. Both have him around 75 targets, right around 100 half PPR points, 150-ish for tight end premium leagues. So we have an extremely similar Freiermuth line. And I feel the same. Like, I don't have them as like egregiously overpriced, but I just don't get a lot of them. I'm not drafting tight ends in that range. And I have to be in a scenario where like I really need a tight end and he's fallen past ADP. Like that's about it. And that's kind of where I'm drafting Pickens too. Is like I really need a receiver. He fell past ADP.
Yeah. If I have like a KC thing built up and I'm like, okay, I get a week 17 correlation. I can see that with Freiermuth.
Yeah.
But yeah, to your point, like he's not egregiously overpriced in my projections either. But then again, I go to the upside thing where it's like, and I still want to be able to tell myself that this guy that's not quite overpriced on a base projection has the ability to meaningfully beat this projection. And maybe he does, because I'm kind of like maybe he could be a 100 target guy. He did have a really nice profile. Maybe he just has a really strong season, but just the overall pass volume does limit that type of ceiling is the key. It was the key for London and Pitts in Atlanta. And I think it's worth emphasizing. I think it's worth emphasizing down the system, whether, like Van Jefferson and Roman Wilson. I don't know. How are you playing any of those guys? I played a little bit of Roman Wilson, but
I play a little bit of Roman Wilson just on like cheap rookie wide receiver that has like a somewhat clear runway to playing time. Like I'm just trying to mix those guys in and not overthink. While I agree with all the systemic stuff on upside, that's kind of, but he's not like someone I'm smashing by any means. It's just like I'm mixing in any rookie wide receiver of that cost with decent playing time chances.
He's priced down. That's the other thing with the Pickens price is everyone else in the offense is priced so far down that there does seem to be some understanding of these trends with Arthur Smith. And I mentioned that on a pod or on a live stream, and some of the comments were like, isn't that a good thing for George Pickens' target share? And it is, but it's also a comment on the offense that there's not expected to be a lot of upside when you can't really even project the rookie for a decent ADP, right? And so Pickens has to be this alpha target earner in that environment. And tough bet.
To your point there's not like this contingent upside we get where there's like 3 target earners and one of them gets hurt and then the base target share goes up. Right. Like the day one's as good as it gets for Pickens, pretty much. Let's go to Cleveland. Cleveland's a tough team. We've got them at a 58.1% called pass rate, 63.7 plays per game. You're a little bit more optimistic on those numbers, 59.5% pass rate, 64.5 plays per game. Again, there's some correlation there. Higher pass rate you're projecting, probably the more plays per game. It is a tough projection. Deshaun Watson was not that great when he played. I know he had ended up with some decent fantasy numbers, but didn't seem like a smooth fit in the offense. And then you get a lot of weird stuff in their data from the Flacco games, including one where their kicker was hurt and they just chucked the entire game up 21 and Amari Cooper scored 1 million fantasy points. So yeah, Cleveland has been a difficult team for me to project.
I mean, again, we're on the same page. My note is ultimately really tough to dial in their play vol with Watson only playing 6 games last 2 years each, plus a new OC, plus Chubb injury, etc. The new OC, Ken Dorsey's had high pass rates. I do think they're going to put a little tempo. I think Pat Thorman in his great pace article for ETR wrote about that a little bit. And so I'm maybe a little high on it, but this is one, like, relative to the last conversation, we're saying like how confident can you be in a projection? Well, with Pittsburgh, I feel pretty confident. I mean, there's still uncertainty, but with Cleveland, I feel no confidence. I'm just making up a guess. Is what it feels like, right? Like, it's really tricky.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you get to Watson, And I feel though I do like Watson as value because I feel like we're somewhere on the conservative side in terms of both his efficiency and his volume, and still kind of like have him spitting out as like, oh, QB 21 is too low for him. There's some base assumptions there where it's like, as long as he's like good enough to keep the job and healthy enough for the whole season, I think there's very few ways it goes that badly where he doesn't pay off that tag in a best ball situation. But sometimes those base assumptions can be like, they seem very safe and then they're not. So uh, definitely not great vibes with Watson. But even last year, I don't have it in front of me, but I know like the end fantasy performances for him ended up like okay, and that was with him playing pretty bad and in some tough games. Like um, yeah, I don't think he's like a massive ceiling guy anymore, but I do think that he's a pretty good kind of like backdoor stack guy with Njoku, or if you took Amari earlier, and there's even like Judy and Elijah Moore, who we'll talk about.
Yeah, I hate it, but I'm playing him a decent amount. I do think he's underpriced. One of the notes with like I noticed that his rushing per game was down last year, and I was like, oh, maybe that's a concern. You go look at his game log. He only played the 6 games. One of them, he only played 12 snaps, 16% of the snaps. When you control for that and remove that, his other 5 games, he was running basically the same, scrambling and doing the things at basically the same rate that he always had. Takes sacks at a decent rate as well and scrambles at a decent rate. So there's another offense that, the pass volume can be influenced a little bit because of those high scramble rates and high sack rates. But he is going to add value with his legs. And I have a pretty strong rushing projection for him, 450 rushing yards, 3.5 rush TDs. That's a big boost to a late round quarterback's profile. If he plays a whole season, even if he's not great, he's going to add some rushing. They add Jerry Jeudy this offseason. They had added Elijah Moore the year prior. They actually have a really deep group of weapons now. And with Chubb injured, like that's part of why I have the pass rate a little bit higher. Like I kind of expected him to come out. They went and got Ken Dorsey, who's had the high pass rate. I think they're kind of like, we got to, crap or get off the pot with Deshaun Watson this year. Like we gotta make it work.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Chubb injury. We'll go to him. I don't know if you saw Ben, but he's squatting a lot of weight already. That video has legitimately moved his ADP. I did the data update for our week over week ADP change, and he was like one of the biggest risers, like legitimately just off that video. He had a pretty significant knee injury last year. I know some people were speculating that like he might not even play this year. Like it could be that bad. It doesn't seem like it's going to be that bad. We both have him around 135 carries, which is kind of crazy. We're like super close on that given all the uncertainty that is here. I've mostly been avoiding him. There was a stretch where people seemed to like get scared of all the injured guys and they started to fall a ton. And I'm like, well, I could make it work on this team if he comes back end of the season, but it seems like I feel silly saying this, but that squatting video has kind of moved him back up to the point where I'm not that interested.
Yeah, you don't need ligaments in your knee when you could just squat the whole defense. The squatting video is hilarious. He's always been a workout warrior, incredibly strong. He has come back from a major knee injury before. I do think there's something to be said about like if somebody's going to do it, you think it's these guys that are incredible athletes. And one of the things about like joints and ligaments and stuff is like the muscles around it. When you have to do physical therapy for anything, right? You have to strengthen the muscles around it. There's probably something to be said about like when Nick Chubb's leg muscles are as strong as they are, like it puts a little bit less emphasis on his knee. I don't know. I'm not a physician, but I'm assuming that this is really obviously tough to do, but to figure out. But I'm assuming that he comes back halfway through the season and is then maybe on the plus side of a committee or something, right? And is mostly doing running, not catching a lot of passes. I have his target rate very low relative to his rush attempts, even as a ratio. But I think there's some possibility he could be a decent runner. I've taken him some in best ball as like a back-weighted production play because he gets so like if you get him after like pick 140, which you can get him pick 140, pick 150. I do think there's an argument to be made that like it's at least worth considering as part of a running back build.
We'll talk NFC North after this podcast. We're recording back to back, but there's something with Hawkinson too, where like you do get, I think, like a wide range on where these injured guys go in draft, where I think like their standard deviation with their ADP is like a little bit higher than the other guys. So, you know, it's easy to say, oh, when this guy falls past ADP, I'll take him, which I know I say a lot and it's true, but like with Chubb, you know, he sometimes will fall 20 spots past ADP. Like no one wants to take him in a room. And that's where like, I'm really like, okay, you know, I'm going to have one of the best Chubb prices and like, I need less from him because of the cost that I got him at.
Right.
Beyond him though, with all the uncertainty around him, it begs the question of, is there somebody else that we can, you know, take advantage of this with? And I early on in the offseason, I was taking a lot of like Jerome Ford and Deonta Foreman. I've cooled somewhat, partially because I'm like, I feel a little bit better that Chubb is going to play the end of the season. And, you know, you're making a bet on one of these guys, and then like they might not be what you need them to be at the most important time of the year. And partially with Ford, he did have like this annoying role at times, even without Chubb last year with, was it with Hunt taking a lot of the goal line stuff, and Ford ran pretty pure in the week 17 stuff, was super important in the best ball finals. Kind of, you know, I think he took a screen to the house or something, but I've been taking more Foreman real late, but Foreman's the one that we kind of disagree on the role with. We've got him basically splitting with Ford in base carries, and you've got Ford a little bit ahead, and then Foreman split a bit more over him, Pierre Strong, and even some Nyheim Hines.
Yeah, this is a really tough backfield to parse. And I would start by saying for me that I am underplaying it. I absolutely expect that the Browns backfield at their costs are going to have more production than their collective costs, right? And yet there's a lot of names there, and I'm probably underplaying. I'm not really drafting a ton of any of them. The reasons on Ford are what you said, that like I'm worried that it's all front-weighted projection, and then he loses work later in the year. He wasn't particularly good in the advanced stuff. He wasn't super efficient as a rusher. He did have some, you know, some receiving TD stuff that looked like a little exciting, but you know, missed tackles forced, yards after contact per attempt, that stuff not great by any means. Deonta Foreman also fell off, and especially in the yards after contact per attempt stuff last year. He's a 28-year-old former Achilles tear guy, didn't get a huge contract, averaged 3.9 yards per carry last year on his fourth team in 4 years. I kind of think just the fact that he's getting drafted late is a little bit. I mean, I think you can tell a story on him, but you can tell a story on a lot of guys that aren't getting drafted very, very late. To me, like, this is a really tough spot where there's just not a lot of clarity. And then part of that is because I go further down the depth chart. Pierre Strong was acquired right before week 1 last year, stuck with the team all year, had a special teams role. I saw a beat report like a month or two ago that he's basically was saying he's a lock for the roster because of his special teams. He's one of the 4 special teams guys. He had a 4.6 yards per carry, got 14% of their overall running back touches last year, and again was acquired right before week 1. Didn't know the offense, needed to kind of build into that. I think he, like, with a special teams role, and he had an intriguing profile going into year 3. I think he's like justifiably a better play than Deonta Foreman later. I would almost argue, because I feel like the roster spot is clearer and he's younger. I would rather just, you know, like strongly prefer to be in a year early than a year late kind of a thing on these guys. But I get why people are on Foreman. I think a lot of it is that rushing TD stuff that Ford wasn't being used around the goal line. But to me, like, the reason I'm not projecting Foreman very strongly is I do think he'll probably make the team, but I also think he's the logical cut once Chubb comes back, because I think they're going to hang on to Ford. They have Strong for special teams. I assume like they're going to keep Ford, Foreman, Strong, and Hines, because Hines might be their primary kick returner, although I don't know if they're going to have 2 special teams guys at running back. It's really kind of tricky to parse, but if Hines is a part of the special teams equation too, then when Chubb comes back, it's probably Foreman who gets released at that point. That's kind of what I'm projecting, but might be wrong.
I did like I said, I liked him more earlier and kind of backed off him recently. We might reduce some of his volume. I do think he reminds me of, to some extent, like I warned of like taking some of these rookie running backs where we assume like the depth chart positioning. I think that there is maybe some of that going on with Foreman, where if you look at it and you're like, oh, it's Chubb, Ford, and Foreman, and Chubb's hurt, he looks really good in that light. But the strong stuff, as you said, is something that we've built in. Part of the reason why our rank on him has dropped. Let's go to receiver. And we both have Amari Cooper for around 115 targets, just under 200 full PPR fantasy points, very similar lines, like 60, mid 60s catches, almost 1,000 yards, right around 6 receiving touchdowns. You do have a bit more volume spread to the secondary guys, with 103 targets to Judy, 71 to Elijah Moore. We've got 85 to Judy, 57 to Moore. A lot of that comes from those small discrepancies in, the play volume and pass rate both being a bit higher for Ben. And some of that comes from, relatively speaking, you're a little less concentrated on Cooper, even though our raw stats on him are pretty close.
The Browns are such a tough team to do a projection for. The running back stuff is like, you're just guessing, right? When Chubb comes back, I'm guessing that Foreman's going to get cut. The receiving stuff's really tough too, because Amari Cooper and David Njoku both had career high targets per out run seasons last year. They both were fantastic. I mean, Cooper's had a long and successful career, but that was a career high for him in terms of earning targets per route. And for Njoku, it was this different role that was a little bit lower in ADOT, particularly with Flacco, that he was kind of their block and release outlet guy, and then but it was so dynamic at it that even though Flacco's gone, I think they might still leave that as like, who would you want as your outlet guy? Like Jerome Ford or David Njoku blocking and releasing? And then once he catches it, he's like able to run through a guy or hurdle over him or run around him. He's just this athlete in space. And that really worked well for them down the stretch. That's why he got so many catches, but he had a really low ADOT. So anyway, like hard to get Cooper and Njoku to enough targets, because Judy, I know people are really out and kind of sick of Judy, kind of out on him, but he's had solid targets per out run every year of his career. Last year was a career low by like 3 percentage points in an offense that wasn't hyper functional, and Russ was not a good fit for his skill set and all those things. But Judy was actually like right there with Sutton. You mentioned a minute ago, like Sutton ran hot on TDs, but their stats were like identical. Like, and I think the fans community thinks Sutton was way better than Judy because of the touchdowns, but their targets, their receptions, their yards, their targets per out run, all this stuff were very, very close. Even their ADOT. They traded for Judy, and then they immediately gave him $41 million fully guaranteed. Like, I know that we're a little bit out on Judy, but you get that type of a wide receiver contract. Like, we talk about this wide receiver window. Judy goes meaningfully after it. He's the one guy that, like, for me, it doesn't make any sense at all. Like, I think he has a floor. I think he has ceiling. I think he's going to play a part of this pass game. I don't think Jerry Judy's like, he's never really been my favorite player when he was like pricier in the 4th and 5th round. I didn't usually like to take a ton of him, but the fact that he's like a 12th, 13th round pick sometimes, or I don't know, maybe it's 11th. I'm not sure the exact round, but he definitely goes a lot later than like Cortland Sutton, which I have some concerns about the Denver offense generally. Judy's working alongside Cooper and Njoku. It's tough to project a ton of volume, but I do think like he's got to be considered above Elijah Moore, what Elijah Moore did the last couple years, and a part of this like trio of top target earners because of the draft, capital given up, because of the contract, because of the what he's done for 4 years. So yeah, I'm probably higher than most on Judy relative to cost.
Yeah, I mean, even with our target projection being a decent bit lower, we're pretty high on Judy, and he's been one of the guys I've been consistently drafting in that range. So I feel that, and Elijah Moore too, I've been taking a lot late. I think he's a fairly solid bet late. The big question, I guess, is if like Tillman or someone comes in and, depending on, who they have play in the slot, who they have play outside and has more volume, but like in Watson stacks. I think I bugged out there for a second. Do you still hear me, Ben?
I lost you for a sec.
Okay. So yeah, I was just saying I'm pretty in on Moore over Tillman as the late round guy, like the last round guy to take from Cleveland, especially with Cleveland stacks. I'm guessing from the target discrepancy you have between the two that you agree there.
Yeah. I mean, I still think there's some like latent reason to believe that Elijah Moore could be something, and I think he fits a role as well. Judy has had higher ADOTs the last couple of years. Amari's had higher ADOTs. Elijah gets some air yards too, but would do more, I think, around the line of scrimmage. Whereas Judy and Cooper are kind of more vertical. They're like intermediate. They're not hyper vertical or anything. But one of the other notes I wanted to say is Amari has been consistently efficient relative to ADOT, which was something that, I talk about the depth adjusted efficiency I like to look at. And so is Judy, has been consistently efficient relative to ADOT in terms of, the way that he turns air yards into receiving yards. And so, that's part of the reason I'm a little bit optimistic on this whole passing game is, I think these are actually like a pretty good receiving core. Amari, Judy, and Njoku out of the tight end spot. Elijah Moore is your fourth guy. It fits for me.
Yeah. Let's go to tight end. Njoku is a guy that we're, I guess, like lukewarm on, like him, but was happy to see your projection being pretty similar because I was afraid maybe we were too light. We've got him at 95 targets. You've got him at 93. We're both at like 695 receiving yards, 63 catches, 5 receiving touchdowns. Insanely close projections for the two of us on Njoku. And, similar to like George Pickens, like don't want to like overplay the splits, but this is one where, again, I think like people are like being maybe too rosy on the splits with Njoku where they're looking at the second half splits and not the when he played with Deshaun Watson splits. And there was some funky stuff with the Flacco and how the offense operated that has me. I like Njoku, I guess, just a little bit tempered.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Like I said, the very specific usage later in the year where his ADOT came way down. He had a career high target spot run by a lot, but his ADOT came down by a lot as well. I'm going to pull it up. But he had 4.8 ADOT last year. Previous career low was 6.9. 4.8 is very, very low. Typically, he's above average for a tight end. He's had years in the 8, 9, 10 range. So very different type of role last year with Flacco. And Flacco's a kind of quarterback that, again, isn't going to scramble. Is going to dump it off. And that was really helpful for Njoku's catches, and he added a lot of yak. I think the upside cases, they still have him doing that in the pass progression. They have him block and release and kind of being the outlet guy. And Watson probably still more likely to scramble than dump off than Flacco, but I think that's a really nice fit for Njoku. And I think this low ADOT thing would be helpful. That's the one part of the Flacco splits. I don't think he can get the same number of targets from the Flacco splits, but it's the one part of the Flacco splits where I'm like, this specific usage could carry over and be at least a little bit of an upside case.
Yeah. Let's go to Cincinnati, last team here in the AFC North. We both have them with high pass rates. You've got them at 64%. We've got 65. You've got them a little bit more tempo at 64.1 plays per game. We're at 62.8. Kind of the differences there spit out like pretty much the same in terms of pass attempts per game, but you've got one more rush attempt per game for Cincinnati. I do think we're both seeing them as a team that's going to be, pretty high PROE with Burrow at the helm and just the way this team operates.
Yeah, really strong +8 and +6% PROEs the past 2 years. Didn't invest in running back, let Mixon go. They obviously brought in Zach Moss, but got him cheaply compared to the running back market this offseason. And Chase Brown got like 50 touches last year and was projecting to play a pretty meaningful role. Didn't draft anyone or anything. I'm curious on your play volume, 62.8, below average. It's an above average win total. It's a high pass rate that you're projecting. Any big insights into why they would be a little bit lower in play volume?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. One, we might be overcounting last year's data a little bit where Burrow wasn't fully healthy. And then they had Browning. They weren't as good. And their play count was down last season, 61.6 plays per game. So slightly overcounting that. I know our model also looks at their pace in terms of like second snapped at the line as like being one of not super slow, but consistently below average in terms of tempo there. So I do think we'll probably come up. I'm looking at our stuff now and we don't have a manual edit on our algorithm on plays. And I think I'd like to make one just based on last year's data likely skewed too low just because the team wasn't as good because of the quarterback situation.
But I'm going to move mine down a touch as well on those notes. I think that those are good points. We'll probably both be converging on closer to league average. I'm above average solidly and don't really need to be.
Yeah. And let's go to Burrow, who we both have throwing for like 4,700 yards, over 30 touchdowns. This is, we talked about CJ Stroud's price, and I look at Burrow, and, I prefer Stroud to Burrow, but I don't see like a crazy gap between these two, where Burrow is going to get more volume than Stroud is going to get, most likely. And I prefer him and like Dak later than where Stroud goes. So I do have him as undervalued. Of course, when you're taking a pure pocket passer, you usually want it stacked with Chase or Higgins. It's tough to take Burrow outside of those scenarios, at least in a best ball format where the stacking matters quite a bit more.
It's kind of crazy that I just went and looked, but I have Burrow, Stroud, and Dak all projected within 3 pass attempts. I was going to see if I have them, different in volume, but they're all the names.
Oh, you have Stroud. I'm going to double check that. I'm almost positive we have Cincinnati with more. Let's see, pass attempts per game. Yeah, we have Cincy is like one of the higher. We have them at 37 per game, and then Houston at 35.7 per game. So about 1.3 per game difference still. But that's with us. I think we discussed on the Houston podcast, kind of like building in some, hey, they're going to throw more with the moves they've made than they did last year.
Yeah, I'm definitely a little aggressive on the Houston pass rate. One of the things I noted on my Burrow projection, I wound up on at a much higher ADOT for him with no Tyler Boyd on the offense. Jermaine Burton, high ADOT guy. Gesicki is a high ADOT tight end who has come in. Jamar Chase has had a lower ADOT the last couple of years for an elite receiver, almost compared to any other elite receiver. He's been at like 9.1 at times. I think it might mean a lower ADOT for Chase again, and where he's really the guy getting a lot of those, quick hitting slants and underneath stuff, which is great because he's such a yak guy. I mean, that's good. And then you also will probably see some downfield targets for him. I think the fact that they were very pass heavy with Browning as a backup QB is a positive for expected pass rate, but also a positive for the offensive pieces. If you think through like, well, what if the quarterback gets injured? I don't think we talk about it enough with different offenses, but it can really meaningfully change. I think that was a huge deal with Michael Pittman last year. With Richardson getting hurt, I think it really changed their overall pass volume, and Pittman got a ton of targets with Gardner Minshew. And there's some scenarios like that you want to think through with the receiving weapons. It's nice to know that if Browning plays, they're going to be high pass rate probably still, and so you're going to get plenty of targets. It's a small thing that I'm keeping in mind when I'm projecting a meaningful pass rate here. But yeah, I agree with you. I think Burrow's a really intriguing option as far as drop back passers go. It's the last season with T. Higgins. Assuming they get him on the field, they get him to play. It's a contract year, and he has a strong season. Like I said, the ADOT stuff with Burrow that I was mentioning is just like, I think that like his yardage numbers could be a career high in yardage numbers. You guys are projecting a big yardage number for him too, like you said.
Yeah. Let's take this to the running back room. Zach Moss, Chase Brown are the two popular picks, and we have the volume pretty condensed on these two guys just because there's not a lot behind them in Travion Williams, Chris Evans. We both have Moss around 175 rush attempts, 40 targets. Chase Brown around 150 rush attempts. The one discrepancy we have is you have 45 targets for Chase Brown. We only have 30. I know initially we were higher on Chase Brown, and we got a little spooked by the fact that he played like no passing down snaps last year. And we want, and just worried that we might be, as a community kind of wish casting Chase Brown a little bit. I still like him overall as a play at cost and just taking this backfield, but just a little less bullish than we were early. We're actually still ahead of Brown's positional ADP on Underdog. We have them RB 36 markets at RB 38 there, but I do like taking shots on both pieces of this backfield.
I did too. I take some Moss, especially in like I've taken them in some eliminator, in some marathon drafts over on Underdog, where you get a little bit more emphasis on the early weeks, because I do think he's going to start the season as the lead guy. I think the case is that Moss wasn't as explosive as his numbers suggest last year. If you were watching the games, if you're looking at some of the more advanced stuff, and then I know people laugh at this, but Chase Brown did clock the fastest time of any ball carrier last year. It was on a screenplay where he just got loose up the sideline and got to run. But a guy who has that type of juice, it's notable. The thing that I think is relevant with Brown is people are like, well, he only had like 50 touches last year. The fact that he clocked a fast time, like that he's just this explosive player, but he's more of like, not a workhorse basically. And the thing that I think is notable is you go look at his college numbers. This is a guy who averaged or handled 25 plus touches a dozen times at a Big Ten school, went for over 120 total yards each time he did that. I tweeted this a little while ago. I noted it included 3 November losses late in his final season where he was Illinois' best offense, regardless of game script. They were giving him the ball. He had 41 carries in a game one time, 36 in a loss in that final season. Like they were riding him in college. He was a workhorse in college at times. And that's something you like to see. We've talked about this before on the show, but like being a workhorse is a skill. And so as far as whether Chase Brown is just a flash in the pan, fast guy or a workhorse, I think that's part of why you get excited about him. You're like, he's got the athleticism and the youth and the excitement that he could just look a lot better on game day than Moss and earn more work as the season progresses because he's just so clearly more talented. And he's shown an ability to handle big work so that he's not like precluded from being able to do that. So as far as like the upside scenarios, the guy that could like break fantasy, I am more in on Brown for that. Moss is the easier play from like projectable volume in a good offense. And both of like collectively, I think this is an underpriced backfield. I want to be in on both. Like you said, this is too cheap for the Cincinnati running back touches.
Yeah. At wide receiver, I don't know if there's a ton to say about Jamar Chase. We both have him around 160 targets, about 1,350 receiving yards, just under 10 receiving touchdowns, over 100 receptions. We've got him, I think, the 4th pick right now, wide receiver 3, which is in line with the market. Anything on Chase that sticks out to you, other than that, he's awesome.
I mean, I guess a little bit of FUD that his target shares aren't massive considering his profile and how his ADOT has dipped a little bit. It's not really as strong as the other super elite players, but I kind of think there's more meat left on that bone is sort of the way that I end up looking at that. His efficiency has been really strong even when you control for the low ADOT, or especially when you control for the low ADOT. There's not a ton of competition. Like one of the notes I have here is whether it's T. Higgins at a career high target rate or Burton or Gesicki or Trenton Irwin or something, there's room for somebody to have a surprising target role alongside Chase, right? And like with no Tyler Boyd here, with no clear tight end situation. Yeah, I mean, I'm very confident taking him on the skill set, right? Like he was a top 5 overall pick and he's been very good and efficient. But it is a little bit mildly concerning that his target volume hasn't been quite as massive like over a full season as like a Justin Jefferson season or a Tyreek Hill season or a CeeDee Lamb season, the guys that he's in a tier with.
Yeah, that's a good note. As far as T. Higgins goes, I do think on, in like home league redraft and some of the more casual best ball sites, he's a bit undervalued just based on not having a great season last year. But you do get the contingent upside if Chase gets hurt. The offense in general is going to be better with Burrow back to health. And I do think he's, a pretty good player. So you've got him at 121 targets. We've got 114. We're both just over 1,000 yards, over 70 catches, and right around 7 receiving touchdowns.
Yeah, I think he's a really nice play this year, contract year. People are out because he was probably maybe a little bit overdrafted last year. The group of him and Waddle and Devonta Smith as those wide receiver 2s going at like the 2-3 turn that got kind of bunched together and then all didn't really have massive seasons has pushed all their prices down. And I think they're all nice plays this year because I still think the case for those plays is still solid. And so, yeah, his 55% catch rate last year, well below 63% each of his prior 3 years. Played hurt, but had a couple splashy plays still showed some, like he had a sick catch like on the sideline where he turned and reached across the pylon for one of his TDs. Still showed some of that T. Higgins upside that we know is in there. Yeah, I think he's a nice play for sure.
Where are you on Jermaine Burton, the rookie here with Tyler Boyd going to Tennessee?
I'm not drafting a ton of him because I don't know about the fit. He was a very high ADOT vertical threat in college, and I think he's more like the longer term Higgins replacement. But maybe I'm overthinking that. But they did use Trent Irwin a decent amount last year. They got Andre Yoshivas that people were drafting a little bit in the early off season. I kind of think they might rotate down the wide receiver depth chart a little bit more than we're expecting. I'm taking some Burton. I mean, it's a good quarterback. It's a good offense. There's scenarios where like Higgins isn't on the field because of contract stuff or whatever that like Burton would get really exciting. So, yeah, I don't know.
Cool.
I mean,
I'm that's sort of where I'm at. Like, I don't have a huge stance on Burton, but rookie wide receiver on a good offense, I'm mixing that profile in, but yeah, don't have a huge stance. We are off a little bit on the Mike Gesicki targets at tight end. You've got 59. We're at 42. I've mostly only been taking him as a Burrow stack partner in the final 2 rounds of drafts. He's always had a lot of athleticism, just had a tough time, staying on the field and earning targets.
Yeah, I think the bull case is that he kind of fills the Boyd slot role because he's kind of been a big slot for most of his career as a tight end. Tanner Hudson is still there. He got 50 targets as the main tight end last year. They drafted Eric All. They still have Drew Sample, who they use as a blocking tight end. So they're kind of deep at tight end. So if Gesicki's not good enough, and at times it seems like he hasn't been, they don't have to play him. They might play just Hudson and Sample and Eric All and all of that. But there's an upside case where like he could fit that slot role, and he's athletic and he's had some receiving production in the past. There's definitely reasons for him. And we've seen the Burrow Bengals tight end be brought along with these stacks sometimes, like the CJ Uzama year and all that. So, yeah, I mean, I'd take a few shots here and there, but I'm not drafting a ton of him.
Makes sense. All right, that'll do it for us on episode 5 of the offseason projection special. You can catch all the episodes on the Establish the Edge podcast feed or on the Establish the Edge YouTube channel. Make sure you're following Ben at bengretch.substack.com and his podcast with Sean Siegel, Stealing Bananas. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll be back with episode 6 before you know it.